I am my grandmother's garden. From a recent journal, JPS. We all have traumas in our childhood that can make us overlook the beauty that surrounds us. Oftentimes we believe we have to focus more on the negative events because they created so much pain. Some of us believe holding on to the negative is what protects us from not experiencing that pain again. That couldn't be further from the truth. Unfortunately, we tend to relive aspects of the negative experiences because we stay stuck by consciously or unconsciously holding on to the negative thoughts our painful experiences birthed. Don't forget the beauty that surrounded you, that fed you and nourished your energy in a way that helped you get here, to where you are today. Take time to remember the joy that existed so that we can reconnect our inner child to those pleasant moments that fed us the hope we needed, that gave us the strength to make it to this moment. You are so much more than your trauma. What I find helpful is exploring my memories and feelings with pen and paper. If you find some quiet time today, take an opportunity to write 3 beautiful memories from your childhood, or simply from your past, that helped you to nourish the beautiful you that you are. By the way, you are a golden soul. Chapter 2. The Blessed Child of 2 Addicts. When you gain the courage to go prowling within the murky memories of the past, you may choose to follow muddy footprints back to your origins. Those footprints can turn into either lotus leaves or pools of quicksand. I'm standing in the spacious, converted attic living area that I share with my mother at her parents' house. In this early memory, I am patiently, not my usual, waiting at Adrian's side. She's in her early 20s at the time, so I'm likely about 5 or 6 years old. I watch intently as she stands looking into the mirror, putting on her makeup to go out for the night. This converted attic is where I grew up, off and on, for most of my childhood. To get up here, we took the stairs that led off the kitchen. The attic housed my mother's bedroom, a long hallway, my bedroom, a common area where I could play, and another bedroom that had a large triangle window that looked onto the backyard. I always loved spending time in that room because it got so much sunlight. And my bedroom, though tiny, was all mine. The ceiling sloped over my bed, giving the room a cozy and warm feeling without becoming too claustrophobic. In the attic, when it's just me and my mother, it is our safe little world, attached to the bigger safe world of my grandparents' home. And watching my mother study her reflection in the mirror while putting on lipstick always intrigues me. Adrian is pretty, with the same slender features and light brown complexion as my grandfather. After applying very little makeup, she lights up. Her eyes shine a bit brighter. All she needs now are high heels and a night on the town dress, and bam, she is ready to make the scene. Of course, I have all kinds of questions. Where are you going, Mommy? Spelled M-O-M-M-I-E. This is how my mother taught me to spell that word, and I always will when I refer to her. I'm going to Gatsby's. It's a club, she mumbles through puckered lips as she fixes her lipstick. Ooh, I think. Are you going with Aunt Jackie? She is Adrian's best friend and my godmother. Adrian brushes her eyelashes with mascara and answers with a smile. Yep. What are y'all going to be doing? Now that's grown folks' business. This answer, spoken with a tinge of impatience, is classic. But since I'm always hanging with her and her girlfriends, I'm used to being in grown folks' business, and I love kicking it with the big kids. Like an older sister, though, Adrian is quick to remind me to stay in a child's place. You know how big sisters let little sisters be part of the mix with their friends for a while, and then quickly change their mind and need the younger siblings to stay in their lane? That's me and Mommy. This memory repeats in other settings. There were stretches when Adrian was able to save up enough to get us our own place to live. Those stints didn't last long. Once we were even evicted after she came up short on the rent. Whatever the situations were, we were blessed to be able to move back in with Marion and Gilbert. If there was any criticism from them, I didn't hear it. Instead, they encouraged Mommy to think about her career. My mother's fondest dream was to one day become a doctor, like her father. He approved of her interest, but encouraged Mom to embrace the nursing field instead. Grandfather felt that because she was a young mother, the rigors of medical school would prohibit her from spending quality time with me. Whenever I watched her getting ready for the night, the prospect of Adrian going out to have a good time with her friends didn't register as my mother leaving to have a fun time without me. On the contrary, her smile made me feel that the future held those possibilities for me as well. As in, ooh, I can't wait until the day comes when I'm old enough to put on makeup and go out like Mommy. In years to come, these nights out took a turn. As I got older, I began to suspect that things which were made to appear to be normal and okay, in fact, were not. Those promising moments spent watching my mother in the mirror, all dressed up, would fade, replaced by more complicated scenes. We both became masters at keeping up appearances. That's where the lotus leaves end and the quicksand begins. Here's what I knew as a child. I was not planned. My parents, Adrian Banfield and Robsel Pinkett, met in high school. After my mother became pregnant at age 17, the two were married a short time later. Their marriage lasted about a year, ending in divorce some 4 months after my birth on September 18th, 1971. Adrian gave me the name Jada, which was the name of her favorite actress, Jada Rowland, who starred for 2 decades on the soap The Secret Storm. Jada's character began on the show as a teenager and aged in real time. So, in a sense, my mother had grown up with her. Even though Jada Rowland herself is white and doesn't have much in common with Adrian or me, still, you might say my mother's decision to name me after an actress could have been either prophetic or wishful thinking. In any case, I couldn't have asked for a better name that was almost exclusively mine. My middle name came about a little differently. For that, Adrian decided to pay tribute to her sister Karen, but changed the A to an O, so I could have my own special version, Corinne. When I was a kid, if I was pushing the envelope or in trouble, fighting in school, acting out, I'd blame my alter ego, Corinne. Later, it became a running joke with me and my friends that if Corinne surfaced, everybody better take cover. The chronicle of how I came to be the blessed daughter of 2 addicts was not a tale told for my or anyone else's consumption, not for decades at least. As a child, I was not aware of the tumultuous relationship and traumatic events that had taken place between my parents, incidents that were full of physical and emotional abuse. Where I once assumed that they were simply too young to make a marriage work, I would eventually learn that their issues ran far deeper. Upon hearing that Adrian was pregnant, my grandmother pulled from her own trauma and addressed the situation by doing for her daughter what no one had done for her. Marion confronted Robsel Pinkett and gave him 3 choices. A, marry Adrian, or B, we will arrange for an abortion, or C, the baby will be adopted. When I eventually heard how Robsel gave a resounding yes, I will marry her, despite his parents' stance that he didn't have to do anything he didn't want to do, it made me realize, wow, that was a life-saving decision for me and the stand-up thing for him to do. His one action gave my life an anchor in this world, yet also sent a message to Adrian that she would have been of less value as an unwed young single mother. This was a message grandmother had already suffered. The need to be perceived a certain way in the world was a trauma response for my grandmother and unintentionally passed on to her daughters. My mother revered her mother, and yet I wonder if it became too much over the years to have to live up to Marion's standards. I wonder if this burden damaged my mother's sense of self-worth over time. Rob's erotic behavior could only have compounded her lack of self-esteem. In his early but escalating throes of alcohol and drug addiction, he could lurch into a level of violence that was terrifying and confusing. The abuse continued throughout their relationship, including when she was pregnant, and though she tried to cope by avoiding his outbursts, that soon became impossible. One day at her parents' house, shortly after I was born, an argument got out of hand. My grandparents weren't home at the time, and my mother put me on the floor to keep me safe as Rob, in a violent rage, backed her into another room and punched her in the stomach. In fear for her life, Adrian distracted him by saying, "Rob, we left the baby in the other room." As he turned to come and get me, she ran across the street to a neighbor's house. I learned this many years after the fact, but it was no less heartbreaking to hear, as an adult, that she had no choice but to leave me on the floor in the house and escape his assault. She was certain I would be safe because I knew your father was never going to hurt you, Jada. After that, my mother wasted no time moving us in with her parents and filing for divorce. Despite the drama between them, my mother continued to believe, correctly, that Rob would never lay a hand on me and that he had the right to exercise his desire to be a father on the few occasions he chose to do so. My mother, to her lasting credit, never talked shit about my father in front of me, and whenever he made the effort to be in touch, she didn't make a fuss. She would take me to see him at the home of his parents, to whom she made sure I had a strong connection. Pinkett was a stonemason by trade, highly skilled, extremely handsome, and brilliant. He was esoteric, and by this I mean multi-dimensional in unexpected ways. He was versed in nearly every subject you could name, a talented poet, and with charisma for days, a natural performer, which I would later experience during his impromptu poetry readings. Rob was eclectic in his interests, colorful in his taste and style, and occasionally really out there. For example, when I was 7 or 8, he sent me a birthday present that had everyone scratching their head. On first glance, it appeared that he had shipped me a family of brass elephants. They turned out to be brass bells, made as different-sized elephants. For someone like me, who later became curious about Eastern mysticism and culture, the choice wasn't so off the mark. At the time, I don't know what had made Rob think that brass elephant bells would ring for a child. But that was the beauty of my father. Although I saw Robsel only in short bursts, I recognized that we had traits in common. One thing I valued early on was how he was always in search of new thought, new answers, always right on the cutting edge of something, whether it was exploring alternate realities or sacred geometry. For someone who was often under the influence of drugs and alcohol, he rarely appeared to be inebriated when he was with me. In my presence, he had a zen calm about him, just a smooth cat. I do remember my father held a look of sadness in his eyes, a glimpse that he was carrying a certain weight, or that was my take on it. He also had a beautiful laugh that sounded like music and a beautiful smile that felt magnetic. I don't know what haunted Rob. I just know it was there. The one thing I never picked up on was his violent streak, but when I was about 7 or almost 8, I got a hint of it when I noticed a scar on Mommy's lower back as she was getting dressed. This scar was not red or inflamed, but more of a whitish, ghostly color. "Mommy, what happened to your back?" My mother didn't even turn around to answer, just continued getting dressed. "Your father pushed me over a balcony when he was drunk." The statement was matter-of-fact, nonchalant, and she didn't go any further. I got the sense that while she wasn't going to lie, there was nothing more she was going to tell me in that moment. Even still, my mom allowed me to see him whenever he requested, and she never, to my knowledge, asked that visits be supervised. My paternal grandparents, on the other hand, made sure I was always supervised when Robsel planned to visit me at their house. And because Mommy knew that would be the case, she didn't have to ask. Besides, my grandfather, Grant Pinkett, a lawyer by profession who worked for the government, absolutely adored me, and nothing bad was ever going to happen to me on his watch. Unlike the predominantly white and Hasidic neighborhood where I lived with my mother's parents, my father's parents' neighborhood, about 20 minutes away, was much more blue-collar and made up almost exclusively of black folks. If I was at the band fields and went out on my own, on foot or on my bike, walking to cross-country elementary school, for example, I was often the only black person on the street. The opposite was true in the neighborhood where I spent time visiting my father's parents. I loved the neighborhood where Shirley and Grant lived. Everything about it made me feel at home. I loved how everybody knew everybody's name, knew everybody else's kids' names, and looked out for one another. The community was family. We were all a tribe. 7 houses up from the Pinketts was the home of Mommy Bobby. She was like a magical character from a storybook. Very pale, could have passed for white. She had big black hair done in a dramatic bouffant. She always wore polyester pants and had a variety of 1970s necklaces with medallions and wore glasses with big black frames. Mommy Bobby loved children and owned a wonderful nursery school close by, which I attended at 3 years old after Grandmother Shirley recommended it to my mother. I had my first starring role in Mommy Bobby's production of The Wizard of Oz. The best and most coveted role was, of course, the Wicked Witch of the West. And I threw myself into the part, complete with a witch costume and a face painted green. When it was time for my entrance, I ran down the aisle of a borrowed auditorium, delightedly speaking my lines at the top of my lungs. I'm the Wicked Witch of the West. I'm the Wicked Witch of the West. Adults began to applaud for me as Mommy Bobby loudly, proudly joined in. That was it. The bug bit me young. Mommy Bobby became like a third grandmother to me. She would always say to my mother, "That child is something. Watch out, world." On the rare occasions when Shirley and I went to visit Mommy Bobby, or the two of us were out on our front porch, my grandmother became very neighborly, greeting friends and acquaintances, catching up on the talk of the day. Some might say, "Oh, did you hear what happened with you-know-who?" No, nobody told me. The person would then proceed to tell the story. The local grapevine worked like that in the Pinkett's neighborhood, especially in the summertime, my favorite time, with everyone outside on their stoop, visiting, washing cars, just kicking it. Shirley had her ways, and they were never to be questioned. After she taught me to play solitaire, I decided to test the format. Why pick up 3 cards at a time from the deck to see if you got a card you needed? It was more efficient to pick up cards one by one. Grandmother Shirley stood over me and very clearly stated, "That's not how you play that game." If I was playing on my own, who would it hurt if I changed the rule? No. Shirley was real about rules, especially with games. There was one way to do everything, and it was her way. A rule was a rule. When we played Boggle, as soon as the sand went through the hourglass, it was pencils down. My grandmother Shirley was charming, but biting, a walking paradox. A teacher who at one point had been a school principal, Shirley had a love of books and words that went along with the importance she placed on education. Both she and my grandfather Grant were voracious readers. My fondest memories of Grandmother Shirley take me back to her small, narrow kitchen around a small table that fit all of 3 people in total. She had a tiny TV in there, which was on 24/7. She was either watching the news, her favorite game show, or any one of her preferred soap operas. I loved watching Shirley talk at the TV. If it was Wheel of Fortune, she'd shout out the phrases before the contestants could. She was quick on her feet and didn't even need vowels. And she could throw down on some chicken. Whenever she baked her delicious salt and pepper chicken wings, I had the opportunity to witness my grandmother clean the meat off the bone like no other. She was not shy about cracking the bone open and sucking out the marrow. If she caught me staring, she would exaggerate the sucking sounds and attack those bones as if she hadn't eaten in a whole year. I would crack up laughing. She would smile back at me. We never acknowledged the humor of it all, which made it even more cool. It was our thing. Shirley Holland Pinkett was a beautiful woman as well, with a lovely smile and a subtle magnetism. Some of my features come from Shirley, I believe, including her square jaw and the deep dimple in her chin. After she retired, Shirley became a homebody. Other than going to church and an occasional walk outside, she presided over her kitchen in her ubiquitous housecoat, with her hair either in curlers all over her head or tied up in a scarf. As she got older, Shirley became more and more resistant to going out. My grandfather Grant did all the shopping for her clothes, the food, and all the necessities of the household. But the crazy part was that when Shirley did decide to leave the house, she dressed to kill, in furs and fine jewelry and a snappy, stylish ensemble. My mother used to drop me off at the curb in front of my grandparents' house when I was going there to spend a night or two. Before we stopped, I'd spot my grandfather waiting for me, sitting there on the porch, a sentinel on guard, saying little but all-knowing. Grant Pinkett was a man of even fewer words than Gilbert Banfield, but he held a love for me that was absolutely undeniable. Grandfather Grant was probably as invested in my well-being as Marion Banfield. The funny thing is that at school functions where parents are supposed to come, it would often be my father's father and my mother's mother showing up for me. Maybe Grant could see that his son wasn't able to be the father figure that I needed, and so he stepped up in his son's place. One December day, when I was 6 years old and visiting, Grandfather Pinkett mentioned, "Christmas is coming. Is there something you want?" "Yes," was my answer. "I want the Baby Alive doll, but I want her to be black." My mother didn't allow me to have white dolls. The Baby Alive baby doll was the it present that year. There was nothing I wanted more. Grandfather Pinkett upped the ante. "Come on, let's go find your doll." All I had to do was smile. He scooped me up, we jumped in the car, and we scoured the city of Baltimore looking for this much-in-demand toy. Everywhere was sold out. We went home empty-handed that day, sadly, but he was resolute. Somehow, he located that doll and surprised me with her on Christmas. Grandfather Pinkett always went the extra mile. He took me with him to do the grocery shopping and on errands. Whenever I was with my grandfather, I could feel how much he liked my presence and that I was never a nuisance or a burden. And the way he conveyed that love for me was to capture every moment in photographs. He took photos of me everywhere, which became lasting proof of a part of my childhood that was innately joyful and full of love. The Pinkett's home was a typical working-class, multi-level row house, with the usual first floor and a second story, plus a bonus floor on the basement level that my grandparents eventually turned into a separate living area. Whenever Rob was allowed to be around, the basement was where he slept. I have only vague memories of visiting with my father in my early years. One instance that stands out vividly was at a point when he was deep in his addiction, and he came by but was not allowed in the house. Drunk, high, probably both, he banged on the front door, begging, "Ma, let me in. I'm hungry. I need a place to stay." From the kitchen where I sat at the table, I could see Shirley in the entryway, calling through the front door, "Rob, you got to get yourself together. You know you can't stay here." He pleaded with her. I could feel his desperation, even if I couldn't make out all his words. She pressed against the door, and the two continued to go back and forth in an exchange that seemed to soften her. She returned to the kitchen and took food from the fridge, placed some of it in sandwich bags, and then went back to the front door. I watched as she opened the door, barely enough to drop a paper bag on the porch. Then she shut it and returned to her seat at the kitchen table, muttering, "Well, at least you'll have something to eat." Then she looked down at her game of solitaire and picked up where she had left off. As an adult, especially after having children of my own, I meet this memory on the road as a stranger. The pain that Shirley tried to hide couldn't be ignored, as she'd done the only thing she could by leaving food on the porch for her drug-addicted son, my father, whom she could not allow in the house. Shirley, knowing his violence and his condition, could be seen in the Buddhist parable of the armless mother who watches her son fall into the perilous, tumultuous, churning currents of life, with no way to save him. Every mother's child in trouble lives through Rob, and every powerless woman who would die for her beloved son or daughter has to surrender to forces far beyond her control. My father and his mother had an excruciatingly unbreakable bond. My father at his core was a mama's boy. He would tell me later that there was no one he loved more, but their dynamic was complicated. Shirley coped with her son's addiction through faith and prayer. She was convinced that Jesus would take care of her son, and eventually he would be saved. She believed what she believed and had a deep love for Jesus that held her through the dark passages. She had another son, my Uncle Stephen, her baby boy, who was brilliant and who, for the majority of his younger years, avoided the traps that had ensnared my father. I never knew what traumas Shirley had survived. If I asked too many questions, she deflected. Sometimes Shirley could be mean and gave no grace for my curiosity. 1 or 2 beers, and she was on me for looking where I should not have been. Don't go looking through drawers without permission. This is not your house. It was in these moments that I could sense Shirley had a story. My guess is that something in her childhood had made her feel unloved and uncared for. She and I had a complicated relationship, just as she had with her son. But I loved her. As time went on, it became evident that she had a complicated relationship with herself. My grandmother believed that although my father's drinking and substance abuse was a problem, her heavy drinking wasn't. Shirley was a binge drinker, but she didn't see that as being an alcoholic. She made this clear at an AA meeting that the family attended to celebrate Rob's first anniversary of sobriety, which took place when I was in my teens. Rob went to both AA and NA in those days. When it was time for Shirley to say some words at the podium about Rob's recovery, the first thing she said was, "I don't know how Rob became an alcoholic." Mommy and I immediately looked at each other in disbelief. I think Grandmother Shirley really believed she wasn't an alcoholic because, as far as I could see, she drank only on Friday evenings and on Saturday, never on Sunday, because that was the Lord's Day. Shirley was old school in her definition of alcoholism. You drink every day, can't hold a job, can't take care of your family. This definition kept her in denial. Functioning alcoholic wasn't a term familiar to her, but that's what she was. Shirley could be extra huggy and kissy when she drank, or in episodes that were more frightening, she would go on long rants all by herself down in the kitchen, and I'd hear her shouting at an unknown antagonist for hours. Who is she talking to? Why is she so upset? I would quietly ask myself. Then there were times when she would be caught up in raucous laughter, fully entertaining herself alone. In those times I would hide, behind a closed door, upstairs in an extra bedroom where Shirley kept shoes and costume jewelry. I distracted myself by playing dress-up. Downstairs, Shirley's volume kept rising as she ranted, becoming more and more slurry and more frightening. There were occasions when Grant felt compelled to step in and put his foot down if Shirley was really out of hand. He would resolutely tell her, "That's enough," or, "Shirley, just be quiet." And then Grandfather Grant would return to his chair on the porch and continue reading his book. He spent many hours on that porch. If he wasn't there, he and I were out running errands. Somehow, he always found a way to be gone. In most cases, I was with him. A child can feel tension between adults, can become hyper-aware of matters she doesn't understand when the matters involve a lack of control or safety. Without full understanding, the child can feel alone, stuck on their own emotional island. I know that feeling well. As I grew up, I spent weekends at the Pinketts, trapped upstairs. Shirley's binges began to coincide with a growing sense of isolation I felt at home with Adrian. At this time, my mother's drug use was not as apparent as Rob's, although it was there. All I knew was that there was a lot going on behind closed doors. My mother was young, and like any young person, she wanted to hang out and kick it with her friends or boyfriends. When we weren't at Marion's, There were plenty of mornings where she would sleep in really late and I'd have to rummage in the kitchen to figure out what to eat, and sometimes find myself experimenting like a mad scientist. What if I eat my cereal with Pepsi instead of milk? I also had a lot of time on my hands. This is when my penchant for mischief turned up as I found things I was not meant to find. Weed seeds, weed paper. What do they do? I wasn't old enough to recognize the world of an addict, but as I look back, I become a witness to how Adrian's addiction was already in play and how it created an atmosphere of loneliness for me. It's interesting that both of my parents, although their addictions presented differently at this time, were never fully available to me. When I go in search of the origins of my broken heart, it is this sense of not being a priority to the two people who gave me life that creates a fracture in my feeling of worth. Rob was an untapped treasure chest of talent and knowledge, although he was mostly considered, well, weird. He was simply a man before his time. If he had lived long enough, he would have appreciated his grown grandchildren as his lost tribe. My fondest memories of Rob are of witnessing his passion for poetry. One of his poems he couldn't wait to share with me. It's called "Nobody Gets Out of Life Alive," he announced during one of our visits. His delivery was dramatic as he dove in. Nobody gets out of life alive. You can hold on to those world possessions, those things you earn each day, and know the reason you do your due. But know what folks will say? They'll say, nowhere was a good one, and mean it from their hearts, no jive. But nobody gets out of life alive. Now you can tell me what you think I mean. I know the score of the game. Make $1 million and go in bed, the end will be the same. But some of us will not listen, and others will say I lie. But nobody gets out of life alive. The poem went on from there, all of it captivating. I love the title of this poem from the moment I heard it because I knew it to be true, even as a child. When Rob performed, he always came alive and shook off whatever burdens he carried. As an adult, I received the gift of a handwritten book of poetry from him. It remains one of my favorite keepsakes today. Rob also gave me one of the most important lessons of my young life. I was 7 years old when he taught me about the power of honesty. It might have been fall. The day was excessively bright and sunny. The weather was pleasant with a slight chill, and we were taking a walk to Mondawmin Mall to go shopping or maybe to a movie. As we walked along, I couldn't help but wonder why Rob was wearing such a big coat. It wasn't that cold outside. He had his hair in a brushed back afro that looked cool, but he also looked contemplative. That wasn't unusual, but today he seemed really deep in thought. I felt real grown walking at my father's side because he didn't feel the need to hold my hand. That's another thing I liked about Rob, how he never related to me like an incompetent child, and he was never on some fake "I'm playing daddy now that I'm with you" flow when he decided to see me. I respected that. He gave me life, but in his presence, I was my own person. That would be the one bit of parenting advice from him that I would carry with me. As we were walking along, out of the quiet, I heard him say, "Listen, I'm a drug addict and a criminal." He paused for a moment. "So I can't be your father." My reaction was a relieved acceptance. He wasn't telling me anything I didn't already know. I respected his honesty. Finally, an adult in my life was not afraid to lift the wool from my eyes and just be straight. My father gave me the lasting ability to withstand and eventually appreciate harsh truths. Painful though it may seem, the finality of his statement never conjured the sadness you might expect. I didn't know what it was like to have a father in the first place, because he hadn't been around, so I had nothing to miss. Whatever devastating effects would come from his inability to be a father to me didn't present themselves for many years, especially in my intimate relationships with men. Truth can be a blessing, but I can't overlook how it can be a burden to a 7-year-old. When I saw my cousins with their dads, I might have missed having a father who could do daddy stuff with me. But I resolved early that maybe that kind of daddy love just wasn't meant for me. I found God in myself, and I loved her. I loved her fiercely. In Tazaki Shange. Many of us are born to parents and families who are already in the mix of trying to survive, withstand, move through traumas of their own. Some do so more easily than others, while most of us, as children, are left caught in the storms of our family's dysfunction. A lot of us had to feel the brunt of it, which left us feeling unsafe, unwanted, uncared for, unlovable. For many of the adults in our lives, this was not the intention, but this fact remains. Consequently, this left us with the need to find solutions to remedy painful circumstances. Unfortunately, those same solutions can show up in our adult lives as repeated cycles of the dysfunction we tried to escape in our childhood. It's okay. We must comfort ourselves with the fact that, as children, we did the best we could, within circumstances out of our control, which left us to believe we weren't enough. In the process, we were inevitably robbed of some of the most precious aspects of ourselves, our joy, our trust, our innocence. We, in turn, learned to reject those qualities within ourselves. As adults, we no longer have to do that. When we allow the little one within to heal and understand that we are enough to take care of ourselves, we no longer have to demand and be blameful when others can't care for us. We realize, through self-care, that we are enough to love ourselves thoroughly. I eventually learned to reclaim and honor my vulnerability. One of the ways was to buy stuffed animals and allow the kid in me to enjoy them, cry with them, sleep with them. By reacquainting myself with the tender one within, I learned the power of my vulnerability. Can you find the moment when you began to reject the precious child within yourself? You could take that further and write a list of the parts of yourself you might want to reclaim, that you didn't feel safe enough to embrace as a child. Give yourself the freedom to decide how you would like to express those parts of yourself on your journey to reclaim them. Chapter 3. Leaving the Garden. Bullying became a problem in the 2nd grade. There was this big boy who had a mouth full of crooked teeth and who would not leave me alone. He got in my face one day and threatened me. "You better bring me $10 tomorrow. I'm gonna beat you up." $10? Where am I gonna get $10? In desperation, I took the money from a place where my grandfather kept cash. It felt wrong for sure, but as soon as I paid the bully, he backed off. His face lit up like I was his best friend. "You really got me the money," and he took off. He made the mistake of bragging on the playground and showing off his money. This came to the attention of the principal, who asked him where he got the $10. He didn't hesitate to answer, "Jada Pinkett." Grandmother received a call from the school and was initially appalled. There had to be a mistake. But when I tearfully told grandmother the story, she knew I must have been very intimidated to have stolen money from my grandfather. The bottom line for Marion Banfield was that the school could have done more to prevent the situation from escalating. In her view, every child ought to feel safe at school. Her conclusion was that I should go to private school. I wasn't sure, because by this point I'd reached the conclusion that there was a vast difference between how I was educated at home and how I was educated at school. Conventional structure did not work for me. My mother's feeling was that I was just bad as hell at school. She felt strongly that I should at least be in a school setting with black teachers, black principals, and black kids, and that was damn near non-existent with private schools. But she was willing to explore options for my sake. Marion arranged for me to have a trial with a Montessori school so they could assess me. My first assignment was to write a short story and illustrate it. Sounded fun. I decided to write a story reminiscent of authors I discovered on Mommy's bookshelf, like Stephen King. Such books were not necessarily appropriate for my age, but I loved horror and ghost stories all my life. So I wrote one that involved someone getting stabbed in a cave by an unknown monster, and it included a drawing. The teacher conducting my interview was disturbed, even though I could not have been prouder. First, I was not protected from bullying, and now I was misunderstood by adults who didn't know me. My attitude was, no, there is nothing wrong with me, and you people are wrong. Was there something wrong with Stephen King? No, he was a genius. Although I ultimately was accepted, I didn't last long at Montessori. Mommy and Marion believed I needed more structure because, ironically, I went from being bullied at one school to running the show at this one. All I wanted to do was play, talk, and tell the teachers what I would and would not do. Our next attempt was another private school. The one-day trial experience there wasn't terrible, but I was not used to an all-white environment and felt like an outsider. As soon as I saw Mommy, I told her, I don't like it here. Thank goodness, I wasn't given enough time to prove how bad as hell I was. Next, Mommy and Grandmother agreed upon a happy medium, a public school, Mount Washington Elementary, where the faculty and student body were diverse. This school was not too far from Grandmother's neighborhood, and even closer to the welcoming home of Uncle Leslie and Aunt Marcia and Cousin Tiffany, where I walked every day after school. The situation was better, but not trouble-free. Being small, I got picked on all the time, by boys and girls alike. One day on the playground in the 4th grade, a much bigger girl approached me, and for no damn reason, grabbed a chunk of my hair and pulled it so hard I thought she would pull it out by the roots. When I returned home to Grandmother's house that evening, Aunt Karen was there, and I told her all about it and asked if she could come to school with me the next day. Karen got that look in her eye that I sometimes saw with Adrian. She said, "Don't come up in here telling me about some girl pulling your hair. Somebody touches you, make sure they don't do it again." I was quiet. My Aunt Karen was so beautiful, and she was just as tough. She had to be. In school, my aunt and my mother were both constantly having to prove, don't let these looks fool you. Karen had survived a few abusive relationships. At one point had her jaw broken by her boyfriend, whom Adrian chased down with a baseball bat, and then had her son, my cousin Brett, taken from her by an ex. I will never forget hearing my aunt screaming for her child, my 1-year-old cousin screaming for his mother, and my mother screaming at the police to do something. Aunt Karen didn't know where Brett was for 2 years. The result of these traumas was that my Aunt Karen and my mother carried the burden in their veins of, I'm not to be played with. The ghosts of their grief and the roots of their aggression left impressions on me, giving me permission to protect myself when necessary. And I learned by default whatever violence I could muster would keep me from my hurt, physical and emotional alike. Karen's words stayed with me. I would, of course, avoid a fight if I could, and I never went looking for one. But as I got older, part of survival made fighting unavoidable, and if anyone wanted to test me, I had no problem meeting the call.